Gimel Amud Aleph, and we pick up with, and we're in the middle of the discussion of the statement of the difference between Tisha B'Av and Avelus, in which even cold water is not allowed for bathing, as opposed to Taanit, where it's only hot water. And both of those statements are theoretically up for debate. Maybe Avelus is only hot water. Maybe Taanit is even cold water. Anyway, that's the issue. Although we ended with a very powerful proof of the problem of going to the mikveh on Tisha B'Av, which everybody seems to assume, which seems to clearly indicate that on Tisha B'Av cold water is forbidden, although the Gemara gets out of it. Okay, now the Gemara continues. Tashma Kisha Amru, thank you so much. It's the asterisk, it's about 20 lines from the bottom, asterisk at the beginning of the line. So when they said on the fast days that it's forbidden to do work on the once it becomes these Taaniyot for Kishamim, once it becomes the more serious full-blown versions, you can't do work. They only said it in the daytime. That we've already discussed before, right? Where the Gemara said, Ma asifat zikenim, is biyom. So the whole idea of not doing malacha and gathering people together is about the day. So the night before it's permissible. Okay. When they said you can't wear shoes, only in the city. On the way it's permissible if you're traveling. The simplest explanation for that is that you have to just adjust to realities. If you have to travel, it's impossible. It's over demanding to ask somebody not to wear shoes. But the other thing that I do want to also sort of alert us to again is the public nature and the communal nature of some of these practices, closing the bathhouses, closing the stores, etc. So not wearing shoes, although it is very private as well. Even an individual observing Avelut doesn't wear shoes. But again, to emphasize that being done in the city, not when you're sort of out and traveling, there's also an aspect of the sort of the public-private aspect there as well. But okay, so that's allowed. And now we get to the point where we're quoting all of this. Hakitzad, how is this possible? I'm sorry. Yotze l'derech noel nichnas le'ir chaletz. When you go out to leave, you can put on your shoe. When you come in, as soon as you come into the city, you have to take it off. Fine. Uchashamru asur b'chitza, and when they said you cannot bathe, lo amru ela kol gufo. They only said your entire body. Aval panam yadav raglav mutar, but you can do your hands and face and legs. Again, that's a minimal amount that is needed, just for general well-being. Okay, and the same laws that apply here, the allowance of wearing the shoes outside of the city, the allowance presumably of washing hands, feet, and face, that's also, and the same prohibitions, but the same allowances are true also by somebody in Chayrim, Benudeh, which we're not going to discuss, and somebody in Avelut. Now, I did say, you might notice that I intentionally left off Melacha, because it is not true that an Avel is allowed to do Melacha at night and not in the day. Here, in the cases here, the Melacha is about, as we've seen, gathering the people and so on. Also, if it's city-wide, or community-wide, you might need to just allow a certain amount of Melacha to get done. But at the individual level, it's not true. The Yisr Melacha applies day and night. So anyway, presumably, though, focusing on the last two, that the prohibitions and the allowances are the same by the Avel and the Menudeh as they are by the person in Taanit. The one thing I will say about the Menudeh and the Avel, and putting them in the same category, is that it echoes the line from our Mishnah that when even all of the fasts pass, it says they start being noheg, minhagei avelut. It didn't use the word avelut, but it said, what did it say? Metem b'masa kedara b'masa b'matam b'vinyan b'nitiyah kibnei adam hanizofim lamakom. People that are basically being rejected by God. And that idea of minudeh is essentially the this worldly status of what that means of being nizofim lamakom, right? So God rejects you and you're basically are minudeh from God. So the community is sort of rejecting you and you are minudeh from the community. So what is again worth noticing is that this aspect of nizofim, the halachic counterpart of nizofim is minudeh. And for a lot of halachot, the practices of nidui that the individual adopts for himself, not just for the community, is parallel to the practices of avelut. And again, one can see it about not mourning that sense of loss and of being and owning that sense of of tragedy, the tragedy of a loss of an immediate relative, but the tragedy of being distant from the community, distant from God, rejected. And also, as we've discussed, some of the practices of Avelut themselves are expressive of the idea that you are not engaged in the community. You're not taking care of your basically bodily needs. You're not going to work. You're just completely, you can't integrate into the community at this state. And it's similar here, practices of the Minudeh. So again, I just will mention once again the juxtaposition of those two, echoing the Nizofim Lamakom in our Mishnah. Okay, so now why is this relevant to our question of cold water, hot water, etc.? Because let's take a look. My love, akulu, when it says that these laws and allowances are the same for Minudeh and Avel, presumably it's referring to everything, both the shoes and the bathing. Ubimayaskina. Now, when we're talking about the bathing, what are we talking about? Ilema bechamim. If we're talking about hot water, so panav yadav raglav nisharu. It would be impossible to say that the allowance of face and hands and feet is allowed for hot water. Why? V'hama rosheshes avil asur lahoshid etzba'o bechamim. That he says, and assuming that we're assuming that rosheshes is consistent with this, that an avil can't even stick his little pinky into the water or his little finger. So certainly, the whole hand, obviously not in hot water, excuse me. So if there's an allowance for hands, face, and feet for water to be consistent with Rosh Hashanah, it has to be cold water. Okay, elav bitzoning. So what it must be saying is cold water is generally forbidden, but it's allowed for hands, face, and feet. Okay, and now what does that prove? So if basically it's saying that cold water is forbidden, so it's talking about the Taanit. Right? So again, since it here says the same law we're saying by Taanit applies to Avel, and we're allowing hands, face, and feet, and therefore the assumption is that can't be allowed by Avel, it has to be talking about cold water, unless if it's hot water, it must be cold water. So if it's talking about cold water, now it's saying that cold water is usher not just for the Avel, but because this Breita is comparing Avel to Taanit, it's saying that cold water is usher even in the case of Taanit, bathing in cold water. So that goes against the argument that in Taanit it's only hot water. So the Gemara says it's pretty good proof, right? It basically equates the bathing issues for Ta'anit and Avelut, and we're trying to distinguish them. So the Gemara says, look, la'olam b'chamim. We're only talking about hot water, and only on Ta'anit, only hot water is forbidden. And hot water is on the whole body, but hot water is even allowed on face, hands, and feet. For a Taanit. Taanit is different than Avel. So what do you do with the phrase that equates Avel? That line of that a person in Nidui and Avel have the same halachot, and here we're distinguishing them on the plane of bathing. Asharakai, it's talking about the rest. Okay, it's not talking, the comparison was not, although it's funny, the immediate thing that it preceded it was the discussion of bathing. We're saying that they're not really being compared about the bathing issue, they're being compared about the rest. The problem is, the rest is the malacha and the shoes. But, so the shoes, we can compare them. You can wear the shoes out of the city. But the malachas, we already said, the allowance of night doesn't apply to an avel. So it's not really the rest. It's only comparing them to the one in the middle, not the first one, not the last one. It's very strange. Rashi and Tosfos try to somehow deal with it and say we're also talking about anointing, but anointing wasn't mentioned in the Breita. It's a difficult answer. The simple sense of this Breita is that Avelut and and Ta'anit are the same. So if you think about what the most obvious evidence we've had is, we've had the Breita yesterday that going to the mikvah is a problem on Tisha B'Av, which seems to be a very good evidence that cold water is forbidden when it's related to Avelut. We've had this Breita, which seems to equate completely, Avelut in the matter of bathing, Avelut to Ta'anit, and presumably based on the statement of a hot water even on the finger for an Avel, again seems to be saying for cold water. So the simple sense, if you combine the evidence, is cold water is usher whether for Ta'anit, whether for Avel, whether for Ta'anit. But the Gemara is managing to maneuver around it and still try to leave its options open. Okay, and still the position on the table that has been articulated is cold water for Ta'anit, hot water is forbidden for Ta'anit, even cold water for Avel. Let's keep on going. Toshma, come in here. The Amar Rabbi Ava HaKohen Mishum Rabbi Yossi HaKohen. So Rabbi Ava HaKohen said the name of Rabbi Yossi HaKohen. Meisu Banav Shel Rabbi Yossi ben Rabbi Chanina. The children of Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina all died. Nebuch, it probably was some type of a disease or something, some type of a plague. V'achat b'tzonein kol shiv'ah. And even though he observed Avelut, presumably he was observing many Aveluts because they died sequentially, as we'll see. So he bathed himself with cold water. So you see, you can bathe cold water by Avel. You see, cold water is permissible for an Avel. Somebody says, no, that whole thing was an exception. That was a case where the mornings sort of piled up on him, one after the other. The time we taught of the Brisa, takfu avelav zechar zeh. Chas v'shalom, somebody has various aveluts that pile up one after the other. Relatives die in quick succession. Chas v'shalom. So what? So there are certain allowances. He chbid sa'aro. And his hair got heavy. So now this person hasn't taken a haircut for weeks and weeks. So mekil b'ta'ar, he can lighten his hair with a razor, meaning not get a real haircut with scissors, but he can lighten it a little bit, cut some of the hair. Umechabes ksuto b'mayim. And he can go, and his clothes are now filthy and stinky. So fine, he will allow him to launder his clothes a little bit. And this is precise. You can use a razor, but not scissors. You can use water, but you can't use soap, or sand, other types of cleansing agents. Okay, so therefore, similar to those allowances, we would let somebody bathe in cold water, but the general rule would be that an Avel cannot bathe in cold water. If anything, it seems to actually prove the point that an Avel can't bathe in cold water, because the whole point of it seemed to be to emphasize that was an exception. Okay, so therefore, again, consistent with the idea that an Avel cannot bathe in cold water, that seems to be very consistent. Amar Rava, so that's the argument, an Avel usher in cold, Taanit only hot. Amar Rava, now says Rava, a different position. That was what we've been dealing with Rav Chizda. Now we have Rava. Avel mutar lichot b'tzonein kol shiva. An Avel can bathe in cold water all 7 days. Against, presumably, the evidence we had before about going to the mikveh, which seemed to say it was usher. This recent thing, which seemed to say bathing in cold water was an exception for the guy who had multiple aveluts. He says, no, that's the rule. An Avel can use cold water. Midi dahave abisra v'chamra. The same thing that we find by meat and wine. What does that mean? It means that we don't have this idea that an Avel is supposed to be in pain, right? That was the question we raised. Why should an Avel be more chamor than Taanit Tzibur? So what Rashi said before was, well, an Avel really feels the pain much more like tsar tvei, like it's very personal. And somehow an idea of the Avelus is to express that sense of pain and suffering over the loss by these acts of self-denial, non-indulgence, or even more than just non-indulgence, real like afflicting of pain. Non-indulgence would be hot water. Here it's even cold water. That's what we said before. Rav is coming to counteract that. Rav is saying, since when do you get the idea that Avelus is about suffering, physical self-denial and about pain? We allow somebody to, have meat and wine. So it's not about the physical pleasures of the body that are the issue. There's the Avelus is about something else. Like we said, might be, expressing this idea about being just so, focusing somebody on the Avelut, completely taking away all the outside distractions, feeling oneself as outside of society, as completely not able to attend to one's bodily needs. But that's very different than the valuing of the sense of an expressing physical pain. Okay, so that's an interesting question. What are we trying to communicate through the very different practices? And he says it's not tsar, and therefore the only issue is hot water. You don't go, maybe you don't want to indulge in pleasures, although about meat and wine could be indulgent. But anyway, it's certainly not about tsar. Fascinating. So now we have to see now about proving or disproving this, because the evidence was that cold water was usher. So Meisvei says, the Gemara will ask you on this. Eina bogeret, top of Yud Gemara with that. Eina bogeret rishal inavelet tatzma b'yemei evel aviha. A young woman who's of mature age, or marriageable age. So this is and still unmarried. So bogeret is a woman who's at the old age of 12 and a half, Nebuch, and still isn't married. That's in the Gemara. The sense that this one really has to be focusing on getting herself a chassan. She's already 12 and a half. half. So she or older. She could obviously be older, but it starts at 12 and a half. Anyway, so she now Nebuch is sitting shiva for her father. If he has too much, a lot of people are hopefully going to be coming to the house to pay shiva calls. If she looks too disheveled, then she's going to be hurting her marriage prospects. So she cannot overly disfigure herself. That's better word than disfigure. Anyway,
become
disheveled herself, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, it's more than disheveled. It's less than disfigured. Anyway, make herself disgusting. B'yemei Evel Avia, when she's sitting shiva. Okay, Hanara Risha, but if she's not yet of marriageable age, she's only a Na'ara, she's only 12, not 12 and a half, because under 12 she wouldn't be Chayv in Avelus, so she would be permissible, not permissible, she'd be obligated, meaning it sounds like there's a special allowance we're making for a Bogeret. So how does this all work out? My love, Birchitza. Now we must be talking about the question about the permissibility of bathing. So Ubimai, now what type of bathing? Ilema b'chamim, if we're talking about using hot water, ain't no bogeres rasha, so bogeres cannot deny herself taking care of these bathing needs. Then the Avel can't even stick a finger into hot water, which again, maybe you could say, well, that's the exception here, but given the extreme nature of that statement, the Gemara is not willing to think that we would make an exception for the bogeret. So it can't be we're allowing the bogeret, this more mature young woman to actually use hot water. That's not possible. Elalav bitzoning. It must be we're allowing cold water, and what we're saying is we'll allow her to take a cold bath. We won't allow, the Na'ara, younger woman. Cold water is what's usur, but that will allow for her. But hot water is like off of the table. So even though they're both usur, there's obviously hot water seen as much more severe. So the Gemara brings this as its seeming proof that cold water is usur, and a proof against Rava. So the Gemara says, again, it could have brought all the proofs it brought yesterday, particularly the idea that there's a problem going to the mikveh on Tisha B'Av, which certainly seems to indicate cold water is a problem. But okay, the Gemara is bringing this to show that cold water is a problem. So the Gemara says, lo, akichu pirchus. It's not talking about water at all. It's talking about makeup. It's talking about eyeshadow and rouge and whatever these things are. And, put on a little makeup. That's what it's talking about. Okay? And maybe it's not even that makeup is usher. Whoever heard that makeup was usher, we'll get to it. By for another. So maybe it just means, therefore maybe it's really even saying it's basically not usher. It's practice. People maybe don't do it. But a Bogeres can't, overly indulge in her Avelus to not do it. She should be, she needs to do it. Again, we will sort of bracket the whole idea here of the focus on this girl at the time of her Shiva is, concerned about marriage prospects. But okay, we'll have to just accept some of the societal realities in which the Gemara was functioning. Anyway, the Gemara says, Lema Misayele, what?
Her father was died. She doesn't have anyone who will take care of her.
Oh, that's an interesting point. That's a nice point, meaning maybe the Gemara has a heightened focus on this because otherwise the father would be the one that generally would arrange for these things. Oh, I like that. Thank you. That makes it a little bit more understandable, like why there's such a focus right now on this issue. But you're right. The father is dead, so it does heighten that aspect. Okay. Let's try again let's try now to prove, or before to contradict Rabbi, now let's try to prove Rava that cold water is permissible. The Amar Rabbi Yava HaKohen, Mishum Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, exactly what we brought before as a question, now we're going to try as a support. So you see, here we have a story that somebody bathed in cold water. So it says, no, like we said before, that was an exception because there were multiple, deaths right after another. The time if various mornings fell one after the other, lighten the hair with a razor, bathe the clothes with water. Razor, not scissors. Water and not various cleansing agents. Okay, so that's what. Anyway, what before was a proof is now. What before was a question is now a proof. Again, it ignores the most obvious proof against Rava, which was the case of going to the mikvah. So now we have the debate. It seems like we've settled on the idea that Taanit Tzibur is only hot water, not cold. And now we have a debate. Only hot water is forbidden on a Taanit Tzibur. Cold water is permissible. And we have a debate what the story is by an Avel. Okay, Amar Rava. Avel Asr Ba'onin Kol Shiva. So, I'm sorry, before I was saying Rava, but it wasn't Rava. Who was saying the previous one that was saying it was Mutar? No, that was Rava. Yeah. That was Amar Rava. Okay, So, Ikadamri, I forgot the two key words, Ikadamri, sorry. Ikadamri, Amar Rava. So now we're having Rava saying that cold water is allowed, and in contrast, Rav Chisda. But there's another version of Rava which is the same as Rav Chisda. Others say that Rava says, Avel Aser B'tzonin Kol Shiva. Avel is forbidden in cold water, just like Rav Chisda said. Ma'ishna Mibasar V'yayin. Now, how is it different from wine, from meat and wine? According to the first version, that was a really good argument that it's not about tsar. So why here? What is the logic to say why cold water is forbidden? So the Gemara says the following: how is it different than wine, meat and wine? So Hasam lifchuche pachte hudavet. There he's doing it to like abate his fear, to alleviate his anxiety. Meaning, similar to the idea we said that we've already seen some exceptions, about sometimes will allow you to, what do you call it? To, like if a lot of aveilus will allow certain exceptions. If you have to go outside the city, will allow the person to put on shoes. There are various exceptions. We even raised the question yesterday, why not sit in a tainus? Maybe because that's unreasonable to expect. So within the things that practices, there are certain exceptions. So the Gemara here is saying an important idea. It's saying, in theory, another should be usher and basar and yayin. Really, it should be. That, the same way an onain, by the way, if you want, it's not like we don't have this idea as a practice. An onain is forbidden in basar v'yayin. So logically, an avil should be. The only thing is that, we need to allow him to do that. Maybe specifically, it's interesting what exactly aspect of that. Is it the wine? Because, some people, that's, again, you have to, some people drink a little bit. You have to be careful it doesn't slide into alcoholism. But some people drink a little bit, as a way of dealing with stress. So that could explain the wine ash. I'm not exactly sure how that has to do with eating the red meat. But again, maybe, I don't know, maybe somehow a little moment to indulge in a little pleasure is a little way of dealing with it when it gets too overwhelming. So the Gemara actually sees here that, maybe there is an idea of tsar, but we have to give you certain allowances. So basar and yayin will allow, but it doesn't mean that we're going to allow the cold water. And there really is this idea of physical tsar during avelut. I should say that there's a fascinating debate in the Rishonim whether to see aninut and avelut as essentially the same practice, or to see them as fundamentally different. Obviously, they are fundamentally different. Aninut is mutter and is asur and basar v'yayin. You don't do mitzvot, but you don't have any of the nihugei avelut. And avelut is almost like everything the opposite. But some want to sort of see that the differences really are more expressions of which exceptions apply at which places. Like by aninut, it's obviously you don't do certain mitzvot because your person is involved in burial. But the asur basar v'yayin fundamentally does apply to an avel. It's just by an avel we make an exception, and we don't make an exception by the onain. Other practices, like, not putting on shoes and not bathing, whatever, maybe should apply to an onain, but we don't want to, but we make an exception there because we got to allow the person to focus, to do the work needed to take care of the burial. So there's an interesting way of seeing it, like it's all really the same, but with different exceptions. I only mention it here because of the basar v'yayin that we know about that idea by aninut, and the Gemara is saying here that in principle it applies to an avel, except that we have to allow for an exception. Okay? Yes?
It's about the issue of the tsar. You were so convincing before that it doesn't make sense to add tsar into tsar.
Right.
So how do you know over here that they're talking about tsar?
Well, because the argument, you mean maybe because if the reason of not doing the cold water was not related to tsar and was related to something else, and it should have used that as the reason to differentiate it from why we allow basar v'yayin. It should have said basar v'yayin, you're right. That proves that it's not about tsar. But here's the reason why, even so, the avel can't bathe in cold water. Forget tsar, some other reason. It didn't say that. It accepted the premise of the argument. Right? The premise of the argument was that basar and yayin is about tsar, or not having it, and not having cold water is about tsar. And fundamentally, if one is usher, not even cold water, and fundamentally, if one is usher, the other is usher. I accept the premise of the argument, and therefore you're right. Basar and yayin should be usher, but I'll tell you why it's not. It's a special exception that we needed to allow, the avel to deal with his anxiety. Right.
Have you introduced
where is it? No, you're right. I've introduced it. The Gemara, though, you have to otherwise come up with a reason why the Gemara thinks that basar v'yayin is a relevant argument to the idea of cold water. That the Gemara is assuming if basar v'yayin is usher, cold water should be. If cold water is usher, then basar v'yayin should be usher. And the Gemara in both places accepts the premise of the argument. amount. So you have to figure out some reason for that logic, and it seems to be that, to me, that's what the argument seems to be.
Might it be that Basar Yayin are luxuries? The cold water is not a luxury.
Right. So that would have been the perfect. That would have been the perfect answer. The Gemara could have said, "Basar v'yayin." No, but that would have led to the reverse. Meaning, you're right. But if Basar v'yayin is mutter, then it's showing even Tanug is allowed. Right. So it would even heightens the question of why are you making cold water forbidden?
No, I would. So I would have. I'm not trying to hold on to the strand of the argument, but it would seem that you would indulge in yayin, especially, and even basar, as a nachama.
Well, that's the Gemara's answer. That's the Gemara's answer. But we're getting to the premise of the question.
But cold water is standard practice.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
You can observe the standard practice because it's not going to take your mind off. This is what you do every day.
Mm-hmm.
But to go to the schwitz or to go and eat
Right.
a big steak dinner, those are
Right.
luxurious things, and that would take your mind off.
Right. That was the Gemara. That was the Gemara's initial argument. If Basar v'yayin is mutter, then if all right, it's okay. But I think we're saying the same thing. Basar v'yayin is a luxury and an indulgence. Hot water probably is in that same category or somewhere in that continuum. Not even doing cold water is even more, is even sar, is even on the further at the end. So they're all on a continuum, and the Gemara is trying to argue one from the other, which shows that that's the issue at stake, seeing it in that way. All right, we'll unpack that more later, but it seems clear that that's the argument, and the Gemara accepts the premise of the argument and just makes Basar v'yayin an exception. Okay, so now the Gemara says like this. Now we're just going to go through the same proofs again. Let me come and try to prove it. So Bogeres cannot again dishevel herself. Hanara Risha'ah. The Nara is allowed or is obligated. If we're talking about the use or non-use of hot water, we never would have allowed the Bogeres to use hot water. It must be cold water, and it's a special exception by a Bogeres, but the general rule is that cold water is forbidden. Someone says, maybe we're talking about makeup. Okay, so we haven't proven it, and again, ignoring the great proof from going to the mikvah. So where are we about all of this? We are basically at the conclusion that by Taanit, it's only hot water, which is an indulgence, right? If anything, by Taanit, you're denying yourself food. You would say there, again, going back to the point we were just discussing, the logical parallel to denying yourself food is denying yourself even cold water for bathing, right? It's not just, but maybe denying food is already enough, and then the only things we're going to add are indulgences. It's not exactly clear. But anyway, it's interesting that at Taanit, it's only hot water. Okay, that's point number one. And point number two is Avelut is even cold water. Now, why is Avelut even cold water, right? One way of expressing this is tsa'ar, and a heightened degree of tsa'ar, and that seems to be the focus of the Gemara. And then you have to explain the meat and wine, why it's allowed, and you make that an exception as a way of dealing with the, with the anxiety and with the overwhelming emotions. Okay, but fundamentally there is an idea of tsa'ar, or you could, against what seems to be the assumption of the Gemara, argue that it has nothing to do with tsa'ar. It's working on a completely separate plane, and it has to do, as I said, with more being just out, completely focused on the Avelut outside of the normal, lived life within society. But anyway, it does seem that the evidence, however you explain it, or the Gemara is settling on the idea that cold water is usher for an Avel and only hot water for Ta'anit. So now the Gemara says like this. Where were we? Amar Rav Chisda, Zosomeres. Since we're making an issue of this kichul and pirchus by an Avel, a normal one, except for the exception of a Bogeret, this tells you Avel aser b'tichposet kol shiv'ah, that if you can't actually do makeup, you can't do laundry either. Now that's a very bizarre zotomeret. Like laundry seems to be the fundamental isur. Kichul and pirchus we never heard about. It's fundamental because the earlier discussion that mentioned exceptions about laundry and using water and not using soap and detergents by a person that had multiple ones. Okay, so it's very bizarre what exactly is going on here.
Pirchus is also makeup?
Yeah. Well, what? Yeah.
Says it's dying from a Greek word, possibly.
Okay.
E-Y-E-I.
Yeah, and so Rabbi Akiva Eger in the Gilyon Hashas, if people have it on the far left, asks the question, And if you look like the second half of it, he says, "Gam lemay tzarich lehochacha miukmazu hanishma mibraisa de leel just hakfu avelav mechabes ksuso b'mayim umuchach mizeh de avel aser b'kibus v'tzarich iyun gadol." So it's a real problem. What type of thing? Now maybe the Zoto Meret was going on something else, but it sounds like it was going on the Kichul and Pirchus, which seems like a very bizarre that he would need to have that derivation.
Maybe
Okay.
could it mean that she can't wear clothes that had been laundered from before?
That's not the language of Tichboset. I mean, you're right; it would fit better. But okay, the Hilchasa. Now the halacha is so that Zoto Meret seems a little out of place. But anyway, back to the point. The halacha is Avel Aser Lirchos Kogufo Bein Bechamim Bein Betzonein Kol Shiv'ah. Abal Panav Yadav Raglav Bechamim Asur Betzonein Mutar. So we are concluding as where the whole thrust of the Gemara had been going, that by an Avel even cold water is forbidden, but we will have an allowance, like we had an allowance before for hands, face, and feet. We'll have that allowance for an Avel, but only for the cold water. Because again, going to this idea that even the pinky in hot water is forbidden, but we will have that allowance for cold water. Okay, but by a Taanit, presumably it's only hot water is forbidden with a similar allowance of hands, face, and feet, but there for hot water. Okay, lasuch to anoint oneself, so put oil on one's body. Afilu koshu asur, even a little bit. That's more like the hot water. That's more like an indulgence, and although it wasn't as much of an indulgence then, but anyway. Therefore there would be no allowance for the sikha, and it's like the hot water. V'im la'aver tazuhama, but however, this is a major reason that people did anoint themselves because they stank. So if you are doing it, if you don't, depending on your bathing practices. So if you are doing it in order to abate the stench, mutar, then it is permissible. Okay, and similarly, like by Tisha B'Av, we have allowances, about using hot water, or using water if you need to get really clean something, as opposed to just doing it, when it's just for the sake of bathing, itself. But if it's really to directly remove some dirt or something, then there are allowances. Okay, so that is the end of that fascinating discussion, which on the one hand, we had a momentary combination of comparison of Avelut to Menudeh, which gets us back to the Mishnah. And on the other hand, we also have the distinction of Avelut from Taanit, which makes sense, but raises again the question is to what degree are the practices of Avelut about Tsa'ar, or are they about, and maybe even heightened Tsa'ar, and therefore more severe practices, or are they really about functioning on a different plane, which could also explain some of the practices. Okay, now back to some issues we've been talking about before. It's funny the way the Gemara shifts without even signaling it back to another topic. But anyway, okay, the Gemara says like this. Tzlusa de ta'anisa hechi madkirinan. Where do we mention, we were talking before a little bit implicitly about whether somebody is considered a Taanit, if it's Taanit Sha'od, etc., other types of things. Implicitly, there's an issue about saying the special tefillot of the Taanit, the Anenu. Where do you say it in the Shemona Esrei? Okay, that's a good question. So, Ad Berei, Rav Yehuda, Rav Yitzchak Berei, Rav Yehuda took Rav Yitzchak his son, the Darsh, and he expounded, Yochi Shakibel Alav Ta'anit, again, interestingly, re-echoing those earlier discussions of the individual, although now we've been totally in the Tzibur context, an individual who accepted a Ta'anit, Mitpalel Shel Ta'anit, has to pray even if it's an individual, even if it's not a Ta'anit Tzibur, you still say the special Tefillah, you say the Anenu. The Heichan Omra, where do you say it? Ben Goel Lirofei. You say the Anenu, which we have as our practice at the Shliach Tzibur says at Mincha, says it in a special Anenu as a standalone bracha between Goel and Rofei, right? Everybody knows that? What we say on one of the historical fast days, right? So here.
It's an added independent blessing.
Here's Rofeinu, right? Here it says, I'm sorry, not Mincha. Mincha is that's the Yachid. The Shliach says, Tzibur says it already at Shacharit, right? Anenu Hashem Anenu b'yom tzam tanitenu ki b'tzar gedola anachnu al teifenu v'yishenu v'al titalem, etc. Baruch atah Hashem ha'oneh be'eis tzara. Now the interesting question to ask is, why does it belong between Goel and Rofei? What's it doing there, right? Now, and one thing I think I'd like to point out is that the brachot, there's a shift, I don't know if people are aware, between the brachot and the Shemona Esrei, between those, although everything is b'lashon rabim, there's a shift between those that are much more about personal needs and those that are about national needs. So, you have dat, slicha, Geula, but the Geula of Goel is much more about like personal redemption. Save me from my travails. Okay, Rifuah. Okay, then you have Birchot Hashanim, right, which is basically Parnasah, and then you turn to, Mikabetz Nidchei Amo Yisrael, Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat, Lamal Shinim, you turn to national. All right, so it's an interesting question whether the Birchot Hashanim, is sort of, it's communal, maybe it's not national in the same way some of these others were. But anyway, but it could also be very much seen as personal. So first of all, right, and I'm just mentioning this because we're going to get to the Taanit Tzibur of rain. If you're talking about the Taanit Tzibur of rain, you would expect it to be in the Birchot Hashanim, Barech Aleinu et Hashana Hazot, if it's about that. And you would certainly expect it to be in, I would say, the more national and a little bit less of the personal, if it's because it's a Taanit Tzibur. And interestingly, we're not going to find that. We're going to find it here. But in the case of the Yachid, what it would be doing here is, I think that it goes to this issue of, what's it doing between Goel and Refu'ah is not exactly clear. But again, the question about maybe it's connected to, I think the most logical sense is that it's connected to this idea of Ge'ulah, again, in that sort of personal Ge'ulah state, and the sense of, Ge'ulah, the idea of redemption very much has it's a funny word because it very much has, I think a clear religious connotation. The way you can get healed, you can get, forgiven, other things maybe, but Ge'ulah has, I think, very much the sense of God is go'el you from your tzarot. And I do think, again, it's interesting about sort of seeing the Taanit and the idea of why at least a Yachid would be the Taanit, connected to that sense of God's redeeming us from our tzarot. Yes.
Also, if we're assuming the reason we're not getting rain is because we've been doing bad things, we've been
Yes.
sinning or whatever, we just said slach.
Yes, but then it should have been after. Then it should have been after slach. I understand. I understand, but then it should have been after the slicha. So again, and I've been saying that we have not been seeing slicha as a dominant theme here at all, right? It does, and again, I will, just to, again, not to belabor the point, but just mention, right, listen to the things mentioned in the Anenu. Keep it Tzara Gedola Anachnu. Okay, that's, look how terrible we are. Al Tefen El Rishenu, so that is the, sort of the Schar V'Onesh and the, whatever, the Tshuva related aspect. Al Taster B'Nechem Imenu, V'Al Titali Mitchinasenu, Ha'ine Karv L'Shavasenu, Yihina, be close to us. It's all about being close to us, right? There's an acknowledgement that maybe our bad deeds have separated us, but it's all about being close to us. Yihina Chaz Dechal Nachamenu, Terem Nikra Lecha Anenu, it's about answering, right? Anenu Lo Na'anu, okay, Terem Nikra Vani Eneh, quoting a pasuk that's all about God's responsiveness, right? Right? So really, I think that the anenu, the theme of lo ne'anu and being answered, is the dominant, and it's kapara slicha is not, and it doesn't appear after slach; it appears after geula. So I think that there is this sense about the need for God to save us and God to help us, and it is, and that's where it's placed.
Is
Yeah.
the anenu in the plural?
Yes.
So, but we're talking about an individual.
Yeah. So, but everything is in the plural. Yeah. Yeah. But it's a good point. You could imagine a private one. Anyway, we're going to get to the plural in to that idea in a minute.
The simplest answer.
Yeah.
But the first three of those brachot, right, are about relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Right, the goel, the slicha, and the chonen dal.
Right.
Right, and then it goes into specific bakashot.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and so this is, anenu is a relationship here.
Right. The only question I'm asking is, how do you see goel about the relationship?
Re'eva and yin, you should be cognizant of us because you are the goel Yisrael.
Right.
Goel.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get into much more specific.
It's more about roe than it's interesting. Okay, I'm not exactly sure. Again, you see our afflictions and you save us from them. Is more about the relationship, but all right.
It doesn't. Let me say more evil.
Right.
It doesn't have the same specificity.
Okay, that's true. It is. You're right. That is true. It's very general, and I do think maybe the point you make about Re'eva Onyenu, because the whole issue about the Taanit is Onyenu, and again, there's an interesting echo of Onyenu and Oni and Anu. What? I'm serious. They have Taanit and Aniyah, and so that's anyway. But notice this is the individual, and the point I also want to raise is, who is this Yachid? So that is being mitaneh. Is it the individual that wants to be frum and just wants to adopt a Taanit and wants to do an extra expression of religious practice, or is it the Yechidim of the Mishnah who are being responsive to the lack of rain, but they're being responsive ahead of the curve? Is it still connected to the rain or not is not clear. All right, but anyway, let's take a look back to the Gemara. Okay, problem is we're doing too much Torah and not enough Daf Yomi. Okay, so the Gemara says, all right, so Reichan Omer ben Goel L'Rofei. So Maskif la Rav Yitzchak. So Rav Yitzchak challenges. You're an individual. That's not an allowance to change the liturgy. You can insert certain things in certain places in the middle of a bracha, but you can't change the liturgy. As a yachid, the liturgy is fixed. Only a tzibur could, can have a different type of a tefillah. Elamer of Yitzchak, rather says Rav Yitzchak, b'shomea tefillah. You just insert it in shomea tefillah, right? Which is what we do. V'chein amar Rav Sheshes b'shomea tefillah. We don't even, right? So if you go to shomea tefillah, which is the generic place to insert things, right? So it says, and we, again, as we've talked about before, by a minor fast, don't do it because we're afraid we're not going to finish the fast. So it only will appear at Mincha, and at Mincha here at Shomea Tefillah, it says, on fast days, one adds the following, and it's the exact same thing without the Chatima. Okay, so the Gemara doesn't know of the difference between Shachris and Mincha, but the Gemara is saying, our resolution is, the Yachid does it in Shomea Tefillah, the Shliach Tzibur does it as a separate bracha ben Goel L'Rofei, like the Gemara is saying, and the other thing we add is that we wait until Mincha for reasons we've discussed earlier. But that's what? Unless you're Sfaradi. So but that's what we're dealing with. Okay, so back to the Gemara. So which one is it? Is it our resolution is to split Shliach Tzibur and Yachid? This is the Gemara's question, and you already see the hint to that distinction in the Gemara, because the Gemara says a Yachid cannot make a new bracha, but the tzibur, if you could, so that is exactly the way we wind up. El Amar Rav Yitzchak b'shomea tefillah. V'chein Amar Rav Sheshes, so says Rav Sheshes b'shomea tefillah. In shomea tefillah. Meisvei, I'll ask you on this. Says the Gemara, Ein ben yachid v'tzibur l'shezem mitpalo shmona esrei v'zem mitpalo teshasrei. The only difference between a yachid and a tzibur by a ta'anit is that presumably the context is this one says 18 and this one says 19. Now, if you have ever counted, there are actually 19 brachas in our shmona esrei. Right. One was added later, but we're going to pretend as if there's 18. So it means that the tzibur adds an additional one. So my yachid u my tzibur. What's the yachid and what's the tzibur? Now, presumably the additional one that the tzibur is adding is this bracha of anenu. So ilema yachid mamash v'tzibur shliach tzibur. If the yachid literally means in your private shmona esrei and the tzibur means the shliach tzibur, which exactly fits our practice. So hani kshasrei, that's only 19. Esrin v'arba 24. Because we're going to find out in a later Mishnah that when you got to the later fast days, you would actually do a whole, the tzibur would daven, not the yechidim, but the tzibur would daven, a special shmona esrei with 6 extra brachas inserted in the middle. So it can't really mean a shliach tzibur, because that would be 24. Elalav hachikamar. Ein ben yachid dekabel alav ta'anit yachid, liyachid shekibel alav ta'anit tzibur. The difference is it's 2 cases of an individual, a private individual fasting. In one case, he accepts to do a ta'anit yachid, meaning a lighter version of the fast. Only daytime, not all the extra inuyim. In one version, he accepts a heavier version, labeled ta'anit tzibur. Again, it's interesting how that becomes a label for a way of fasting and not just the reality of communal. Starting the night before, the extra inuyim. So those differences, in addition to the obvious issues of starting at the night and the extra inuyim, the differences in terms of prayer is okay, so with 118 and 119, so therefore it can't mean a real tzibur, it needs to mean an individual who's doing a heavy fast, and you see if an individual does a heavy fast, ta'anit tzibur, it's 19 brachot. So the Gemara says, Shma mina, we see from this, Yachid kovea bracha latzmo, a Yachid can't make it a bracha. If you're doing a heavy fast, starting the night before, you would even do an anenu in the Shmona Esrei as a separate bracha. So that's a proof. So it's funny, a proof that starts by saying it's done by the tzibur becomes a proof that a yachid can do it. So the Gemara says, no, it is a shliach tzibur. The yachid never does an extra bracha, set a standalone. It would only be in shomea tefillah. This is the tzibur. Now, if it's the tzibur doing it, why is it 19 and not 24? The question you asked, shliach tzibur esrin va'arba matzli, doesn't the shliach tzibur do 24? Don't you do in chazar sashatz on a fast day 24? So the Gemara says, that's the Gimel Ta'aniyot Rishonot. I'm sorry. We're talking about the first 3 fasts, the lighter ones, right? that start even as a tzibur fast, start with only in the day, not the night before, not the forbidden melachot, forbidden taniyot, etc. The lekashim v'arba, there's not 24. So basically, when it's a communal fast, the shliach tzibur will do the bracha of anenu when in the lighter communal fasts, and he'll do the 24 brachos in the heavier communal fasts. A yachid, according to this, will always do it in shomea tefillah. Okay? Interestingly, I should say that the Gemara is interesting, the Gemara's emphasis on shaliach tzibur. Right? You could have said, when the community is having a tzibur ta'anit, then the yechidim in their own shmona esrei say it. But the Gemara doesn't accept that as a possibility. So the Gemara presumably assumes that in your private Shmona Esrei, whether you're doing a Taanit Yachid or a Taanit Tzibur, we're not going to allow you to change the liturgy. So you're only going to add it in Shomei Tefillah. And that's what we have in our own private Shmona Esrei. Like even on Tisha B'Av, we don't make it a separate bracha. We only add it in Shomei Tefillah. The only time there's going to be a new bracha is in the Chazaras Hashat, which really represents the entire community as a whole. And for that Chazaras Hashat, for the earlier Taniyot, it's Anenu, it's one extra bracha. For the later Taniyot, it's 6 extra brachas, you get to 24. Okay, so that's our basic structure. So Gemara says, "Hello, now is this really true that you don't have 24 brachas in the first sets of fasts? Daha ein bein ktani." It says there's no difference. Ein bein gimel rishonot legimel amsayot. We have a braita. There's no difference between the first 3 and the middle 3. Ela shebe'elu mutarim b'asiyat melacha, be'elu asurim b'asiyat melacha. Except that these are permissible to do melacha, and these are forbidden to do melacha. Now that's pretty funny because I could think of a lot of other differences, right? because they're all. I didn't only put some of them on the board. The question about does it apply the day before? Sicha, rechitza, sicha, nilata, sandal, tashmish. Okay, so I don't get it exactly, but somehow we're meaning maybe like instead of the obvious stuff, okay, that's directly about the fasting and the inuyim, these are the differences. Okay, so but nothing else. So you see the tefillot are not different. So the Gemara says, when it comes to the 24 brachot, they're the same. So presumably you start the 24 even in the first 3 fasts. It says, no, Tana Vashir. Nah, he taught it and he left stuff off. It's an incomplete list. It's an abbreviated list. Gemara says, my shir, the high shir. What did he leave off that he also left this? Because you don't leave off just one thing. If it's abbreviated, if you're leaving one thing off, you might as well list them all. So you can only leave off if you're leaving off more than one. So the Gemara, now of course, you could have said everything we just said, night before, all the extra names, somehow that's like off the table. The 2, in addition, ha'in bein tani, it says there's no difference. No difference sounds like literally no difference. Ella, fine, I'll give you another answer. Tana isuri kamari, betfilos lo kamari. He's not dealing with prayer. He's not dealing with liturgy. He's dealing with practices. Liturgy is a different discussion. Okay, so you can't prove anything from there. And even though it says there's no differences, it wasn't talking about prayer. And we will still say that by prayer, the chaf dalet, the brachot, only start in the middle, in the later fasts. The ibai sema, and they don't start in the first 3. It says, and if you want, I could tell you, since it says there's no difference between the first 3 and the middle 3, maybe I'll concede the point. Maybe you're right. Maybe the 24 brachot don't start in the middle. Maybe they only come at the big 7 at the end. Right? Here's the difference. Right? What have we said the difference is? The difference of this is obvious. Right? This becomes full with the extra things, no malacha. Right? That's obvious. What gets added here? I'm sorry. The difference between here and here is that this goes from like partial and to full. What's the difference we know between these and the last 7? So the only thing we've mentioned so far is closing the stores. Not too much of a difference, right? So the Gemara says maybe the full-blown here, when it really gets to the height of it, you only say the 24 brachot here. What is the status of these middle for the 24 brachot? That is the question. Okay, this clearly not, this clearly yes, what's the middle? So the Gemara says, maybe you're right. Maybe at this stage it's still not fit to do the full 24. Maybe only for the last 7. Okay? And that would fit, therefore, for the ein bein. Okay, so, whoa, do you not do that? Vatanya, don't we teach in a brisa? Ein bein gimel shniyot l'sheva achronot. The only difference between the middle 3 and the last 7 is shebe'elu matri'in v'no'alim et hachanuyot. In the last 7, you do blasts, presumably shofar blasts, and you close the stores, right? Halachol divrehen and all other things, zev v'zeh shavim, they're the same. So presumably they're the same tefillot of 24. Maybe it's an incomplete list. Again, it says no difference. No difference sounds like no difference. So the Gemara says, Tispera, does that really make sense? Ein bein dafka, using ein bein is so precise. It literally means no difference. Vashir teva. It forgot the whole bringing the ark out to the Aron, out into the middle of the street. So what we are going to find out is that in these last 7, the Gemara is going to speak about a whole procedure of 24 brachot for the Shmona Esrei, for the 18 brachot. The Aron is brought out into the street. Okay, we have a whole special liturgy. Okay, and matri'in, which we haven't seen yet, which is presumably shofar blasts. So the Gemara says, yeah, it's not true that these are basically all the same. You don't have the Aron in this meat. You're not saying some differences. So the other difference you're not saying. And by the way, these are all similar. The one difference we did mention, which was in the Mishnah, was the shofar blast, which is a tefillah-related type of thing. So if you have a difference about this, and you have a difference about the Aron, it makes sense. And you also have a difference. That's here where you're saying, only here do you start saying the 24 brachot.
They haven't introduced the content of those additional 6.
Correct. We're getting to it. No, later paragraph. So the Gemara says, okay, Vashir Teva, so it didn't talk about the Aron, so therefore it's an incomplete list, and also another difference is the 24 brachot. So the Gemara says, Imishum Teva, if it's because of the Aron, so Lav Shirahu, that's not a real thing that was left off of the list. Why? Mili de Tzinaktani, Mili de Farhesya Loktani. Things in private we're mentioning, things in public we're not. Now it's pretty funny that it calls a shofar blast something. The Aron is in public; it's out in the middle of the street. It's calling a shofar blast private. So Rashi says it's private because it's indoors. It's in the shul. It's not out in the middle of the street. Okay, and I guess the Shmona Esrei is also indoors. So it's pretty funny because all of those are real communal types of experiences. It seems to be a pretty hair-splitting distinction. Anyway, but
needs to be closed behind something.
That's true. Okay, anyway, now what we're arguing is that the 24 only in the last 7, which fits to the idea of matri'in and fits with the Aron, those get a special whole series of tefillot. Masnisi nami dika diktani. It's also implicit in our Mishnah because it says, Amar Ravashi, Masnisi nami dika, ma elu yiterot al rishonot, elo shebe'elu matri'in v'nolin et hachanuyot. It says that the last fasts, the 7, you do the blasts and you close the stores. Aval b'chol divreihem zev v'zeh shavim. We're going back to arguing that you have, again, the same argument just repeated, except before it was a Breita, and here it's the Mishnah. But it's the same argument that the middle are being compared to the last. So presumably, if you do the 24 brachot at the last, you do them in the middle as well. It's like rehashing the same thing. Again, here just playing on the text of the Mishnah. Maybe it's an incomplete list. It says what are them? It seems like it's a full list. Elo shebe'elu, only these. Like it seems like it's a full list, and therefore again, since it did not distinguish with the brachot, it sounds like you do make the brachot in the middle. So the Gemara says, "V'tispera." Does that make sense? Ma'ilu dafka vashir lateva. It's not a full list. It didn't mention the bringing the Aron into the street. No, Mishum Teva Lachiuru. That's not really being left off of the list. Now here's a different answer. Here's where it shifts gears. Not because of Farhesi and Sinna, which was a weak answer, but Mishum Tekachashivle Beidach Pirka. The Aron gets mentioned in a later parak, so it didn't have to appear in our Mishnah as one of the differences between the middle and the last So the Gemara says, okay, but if that explains something that's not mentioned and not included in these, here are the differences, as long as it's mentioned later as a difference. So Hashdasis Lahachi, now that you allow some differences to be mentioned in a later parak and not excluded from the equation made here, so Esrim Varba Nami Laf Shirahu. So the 24 also isn't something that's left off of the list, meaning isn't implicitly being equated. Diktani Labi Idach Pirka. Because the later parak mentions the 24, and it mentions it by the last 7. So what we are basically saying is that our Mishnah mentions only the matri'in. Okay? That seems to indicate that they would be the same, right? This is the middle. I know, I need more colors. Anyway, this is the middle. This is the first, right? And this is the last. Okay, last 7. Okay, so anyway, so our Mishnah says the middle are like the last, except for the matri'im and the stores. So that suggests that the issue of the 24 brachot are the same. So the Gemara says no, that's only in the end, and then it's okay. That's only in the end. It's not here, and it's not a complete list. Okay, and so then it deals because there's this other difference, Aaron, that also isn't mentioned in the equation. So the Gemara says, well, the reason Aaron isn't mentioned in the equation is not because it's an incomplete list. It's because Aaron is mentioned in the later parak that's the last 7 days. So the Gemara says, okay, but you know what else is mentioned in the later parak that's only on the last 7 days? The 24 brachot. Mm-hmm. So both of these are mentioned in a later parak that they're in the last 7 days, and therefore they should not be assumed to be included in the equation being made here. Okay, and in the end, the Gemara seems to be concluding that these 24, and it works together, the matri'in and the aron and the 24, that all of that is only in the last 7 days, and only there do you say the 24. So the Gemara says, okay, my have Allah, what was the upshot of all of this? So, Amar Shmuel bar Sasartai, v'chein Amar Rabbi Chia bar Ashi Amar Rav, ben Goel l'Rofe. So, abandoning for a moment the question of when do you say the 24, what do you do about the individual making the Shemona Esrei? So he says between Goel and Rofe, a separate bracha, Rav Ashi Amar Mishmei Rav Yanai Braid Rav Yishma b'Shomei Tefillah, v'Hilchasa b'Shomei Tefillah. The halacha is you do it in Shomei Tefillah, and that's what we do. Even in a Taanit Tzibur, when we're doing our private Shemona Esrei, we say Anenu in Shomei Tefillah. The Gemara's conclusion now is, this is getting way too confusing, and I need different things. But anyway, the Gemara's conclusion is in your private Shemona Esrei, whether you are doing a Taanit Yachid or a Taanit Tzibur, right? Doesn't matter. In your private Shemona Esrei, you do it in Shomei Tefillah. In Chazaras Hashatz, okay, we won't talk about our historical fast. It's coming up later. But you basically, in the first 3 of them, you do it in Anenu, between Anenu as a separate bracha, bein Goel l'Rofe. In the last 7, you do 24 brachot. Here you're only doing 19 brachot. Okay, actually 20, but fine. And the question is the middle 3. Okay, that's what we've been debating. Is the middle 3, how do you deal with the ain bains? What's the issue with the middle 3? But the Gemara seems to be saying that the middle 3 seems to be coming to that conclusion, seems to be leaving the 24 brachot for the end, which is consistent with the end that you have the matri'in, right, which are the shofar blasts, and you have the teva, and you have a real expansion of the tefillah coming at the end. Okay, let's. I said we're going to try to go a little bit longer to try to catch up, so let's do it. Okay, so Tani Chad now. Tani Chada. That pregnant women and nursing women fast in the first days, but not in the last days. Okay, so which is bizarre because the first are usually lighter. But here the idea is that maybe it's getting to be too much already, especially if the last is the last 7. That's a lot. Okay, so only in the first days. The Tanya Idach, we have another braita that says mitanot ba'achronot ve'ein mitanot b'rishonot. Only the last days, not the first days. The Tanya Idach ein mitanot lo b'rishonot v'lo ba'achronot. Not in the first and not the last. So they seem to all be contradicting, right? One says only. So basically, you have. One says A and not B, right? Well, and the other says, it says B and not A, and the other says not A and not B, right? They all say the only fourth possibility would be to say both the first and the last, but they all seem to be contradicting. So in about 2 words, the Gemara is going to make them all reconciled. Listen to this, and without even changing a text, the Gemara says, "Amar Ravashi, nikot and si'ita biyadcha demetartzin kulu." Just grab the middle ones and everything fits. What does he mean? He means that first and last are relative. So what he is saying is that if you have first, middle, and last, okay? So he says like this. You know which day? So you don't fast here, okay? You don't fast here because that's 7. It's too much. That's way too much to ask for the Ubert and Meinikas. You don't fast here because it's only the beginning, it's lighter, it only starts in the daytime, it's not yet serious enough to demand that the pregnant women, nursing women do. And the only time is here where it's heavy enough to be fasting and not too protracted that it would be unbearable. Now, how does that fit? The one that says only the first and not the last, it's talking about the first, it's talking about the weighty ones. This is not the weighty one. So only the first and not the last. Okay? This is first, that's last. The one that says only the last and not the first is starting in the opposite direction. So it's not the first, but it is the last, right? Because it's the last following the first. It's later. Achronot doesn't have to mean the last, the later ones. And the one that says not the fast and not the first and not the last means literally the first and the last. So you get the middle. All right? So there you go. With that thing, you've solved all three brightot. Yes?
There's another time off. The Rambam holds that pregnant Muslim women only fast on the last.
Against this conclusion of this
Against
Gemara.
this-
All right, I don't know what to say about that.
Well, actually, one possibility is that they take the middle. Doesn't mean the middle fast, but the middle.
Aha, interesting. Okay, I see that I'm losing my crowd here, so I guess we won't be going for a longer thing. So we'll end here, but if people could just wait 1 minute, and we will say the tefillah for the.